Okay, so welcome back to more in the series on pharmaceutical strategy, and particularly with relevance to positioning this time. So one question that we get a lot is around the role of co-positioning, by which people usually mean when you have two drugs in the same portfolio that largely target the same indication and the same physicians and the same patients theoretically. So what do you do to resolve that essential problem? Well, if we look back to the videos that we covered on active versus passive positioning, the biggest problem that you're ever going to have in positioning a portfolio is if you allow your organization to do passive positioning, so to take a molecule and then let people figure out really where it should go passively. So wherever the physicians think it should fit, because then if you have two molecules that look essentially similar, well, and you did the same things to them, and then you've communicated them the way that people think that you should communicate them, well, you're automatically going to have a problem because people are going to find it very hard to differentiate. I mean, just as an example, if you took two guitars and said, well, what does a guitar do? Well, a guitar, plays, if you're any good at it, music, and they're all the same. Well, of course they differ. They have different sort of points. They have different reasons to exist. They have different price points. They have so many different things. But if you've just gone out there and said, well, look, I've got two guitars, I need to explain how they fit. Well, you're going to need to dig a little bit deeper. So then it comes back to strategically, well, what are your ambitions? And let's say that you didn't launch them at the same time, so you probably have a different goal for one of them versus another. You need to remember, of course, and hypothetically, when you started developing them, you had an ambition that one would overtake the other or one would do something different. So we need to remember that they have different roles, they have different tasks in your portfolio for you and for the people that you want to talk to. But essentially, co-positioning boils down to a challenge of a clear story that you need to be comfortable with, that these two products or more coexist. And you need to deliver that story because you know more about these products than anyone else does. You can't rely on telling a basic passive story about these products and hoping that the customer somehow will figure it out. Or we've seen people do this, even have two different reps detailing the two brands within the portfolio in the hope somehow that a co-positioning will fall out of that. You need a clear story about why you have these two brands. And you don't have to be versus each other. You don't have to compare them to each other, but you do have to have a clear story for why you have both. And that can be, here's A and here's B, and A does this and B does this, and you don't have to refer to the other. But at some point, someone's going to ask you, well, how do you compare these two? And it's remarkable how often companies don't take that as their responsibility to be able to explain why you have two different products in the same portfolio. Someone inside probably already knows, but we've just forgotten to tell the customer. So this only resolves if you approach this actively. The passive approach will never work. You'll end up with a portfolio full of the same thing, essentially, if you allow this to happen. But then you come back to what we were discussing, in several videos ago on the idea of what efficacy actually means and what safety actually means and tolerability. Every drug pulls apart on what we would call an efficacy wheel. So as you start to break down what really efficacy stands for with any particular drug, so many of the endpoints, different patient groups, different patient segments, different stages of disease, different preferences that they have for efficacy versus tolerability or whatever it might be. The physician segmentation, do they see these products or could they see them differently? Is there a different goal of treatment? Are you trying to achieve disease modification with one and symptomatic treatment with another? So there's probably 100 dimensions on which you could be relatively comfortable that you could find a natural co-positioning, a natural separation of these two products. And that natural separation might not be the one that you like. It might favor the older drug instead of the newer one, for example, but that's your job, is to work your way through the active co-positionings that allow you to tell a story about where one product fits in another one. And one of those will be favorable to you. One of those will meet your ambition. But if you just start with a kind of natural view of, these drugs do basically the same thing, but one's oral and one's injectable, well, guess what's going to happen? You're going to end up with a natural, passive, framing of oral versus injectable, which probably isn't what you're going to want. So co-positioning is about you doing the hard yards instead of your customers having to do it on your behalf. And actually, here's the thing that I've seen a lot. Sometimes people think the rep will figure it out when they're with the physician. That is abdicating responsibility from the global level about how your portfolio really should hang together. So if you import what we would call a kind of customer construct, which is that, you might well see these products as very similar, but it's very unlikely that your customers do. Your customers who use these products day in, day out know that they separate. They have hunches about where they fit and which patients they're best for and so forth. It's your job to import that customer construct, not necessarily do it through the kind of terrible patient journeys that people end up doing these days, but but to do a real one, to do a real customer construct, and to say, well, look, on which dimensions do my products begin to matter to the people that might become customers. So that's the job of you and your portfolio. So, clearly delineating why and where you see these two products coexisting naturally. But then you've got to do a bigger job. You've got to go and say, well, actually, that's nice for us. That's a portfolio story for us. But actually, that portfolio also has to exist against everything else that's out there. So you have to co-position not just your own assets, but co-position your assets versus every other asset, that's every other product that someone might choose to use. So direct and indirect competition. Should you choose to be part of a class, that's up to you. That's a choice. But then you've got to say, well, versus everything else in the class, we either differentiate qualitatively or we differentiate quantitatively, and here's how and why. So your job is to co-position internally and then externally against everything else that you might be coming across. So it's relatively straightforward, and it's worth continuing to challenge the natural way that these things end up, because usually if your positioning approach is just to say nice things about the data that you have, well, there's a good chance that you've collected very similar looking data for probably very different drugs, and then you're going to try and use that data to somehow separate. It won't. Hence the job of positioning earlier, which is to deliberately choose different data to use for your drugs. So actively co-positioning, just to summarize, you need a clear story about why these two products coexist, why one guitar is not the same as the other. You then need to be able to explain to them, your customer, why those two products also are worth their time versus everything else in the space. So that's really where portfolios come together. A portfolio should be a collection of products that address different unmet needs of the customer. So if you import that customer construct, then you can begin to say, well, actually, look, our portfolio that we thought was half full actually is mostly empty, because the things that the customer wants are not here. We just don't have most of what they want within our portfolio. So then you can begin to set the job for business development, for everyone else to go and look at, well, what else can we pull into this portfolio that addresses these unmet needs. So importing a customer construct allows you to really begin to think about your portfolio holistically, rather than just as a problem to solve for we need to communicate these two drugs out when we're really not sure why anyone would use one over the other. You need to be very clear about why they do and what room is left for someone else to fill. So very short, very sweet, but the definitions of co-positioning are already a clue to how you can begin to solve that problem. So thank you.